Hello, and welcome back to the competitive biography of Emanuel Lasker. The date is January 2nd, 1890. The new year is upon us. The players, of course, took the previous day off to celebrate the new year, as one does. But now Lasker and Mieses are back to continue their match. We are in game number 3, first to 5 wins, still very early on. Not much to talk about. Let's get into the chess. Lasker with his second white game opens in the same way as the first, with d4. This time Mieses decides to respond with d5, and after c4 he accepts the queen's gambit, d takes c4. Lasker plays knight to f3, and Mieses once again goes for a slightly less common move than normal, c5. This move marks the Günzburg defense. The move had been played twice prior to this game from what I could find, though neither of the games were played by Günzburg. Let's go into a little bit of the trivia about this opening. After the move e3, Günzburg played the move bishop to g4 in a 1904 game against the British master Henry Atkins. Play continued bishop captures on c4, e6, queen a4 check, knight to d7, and knight e5. Now here, if Günzburg had played the move knight to f6, he'd have something in the realm of a manageable position, but he blundered here with bishop to f5, which fell very simply to knight d7, queen d7, and bishop to b5, simply winning the black queen. And so it was here on move number 9 that Günzburg resigned the game. If this game is the reason why c5 is known as the Günzburg defense, that seems like something of a cruel joke in my opinion. As for the games that took place prior to this one, both of them had the moves c captures d4 and bishop captures on c4. And now the move order from here is different, but both games reached the following position. After e6, ed4, knight f6, castles, knight c6, knight c3, and bishop to e7. In 1887, Joseph Blackburn played the move bishop to f4, and his opponent, the Austrian master Bertold English, castled. Blackburn would ultimately go on to win this game. 2 years later, at the New York 1889 tournament, Blackburn would again have the white pieces, and he would play the move bishop to e3 against the Russian Mikhail Chigorin, who also castled here. That game ultimately ended in a draw, but it is worth mentioning that Blackburn was winning for a significant portion of it. So all that trivia aside, Lasker decided to go for a new move for the time in d5. Now, from this position, around 100 games have seen the moves e6, knight c3, knight f6, e4, e captures on d5, e5, and knight f to d7. Now here, most white players have played the move bishop to g5, though there have been a few games where they've taken on d5, either with the knight or with the queen, regaining one of their sacrificed pawns. But Mieses ensures that no gameplay of the sort will take place, as he instead goes for a wildly different move, knight to d7. This move is a novelty, and so for the second time we have a very early one. It is as of move 4 that the players are playing a unique game. Now the point behind knight to d7 is revealed rather quickly. After Lasker plays e4, Mieses responds with knight to b6, trying to defend the c4 pawn. Now, very rarely in the Queen's Gambit accepted is black advised to hold on to the pawn, and not only is this setup no exception, it's arguably even worse than the usual constructs that arise after b5 and such. It's refuted in pretty much the same fashion as well, as here Lasker thrusts forward with a4, very transparent threat. He wants to play a5, kick the knight, and go after the c4 pawn. How does Mieses deal with this threat? If he plays a5 himself, yes, it does stop the threat of Lasker playing a5, but black is just permanently weak on the b file now, and so for example, knight to c3, you can imagine at some point this knight is going to jump into, say, b5 and wreak a lot of havoc on the queen side, but not only that, this still just doesn't stop the pawn from being lost, because let's say black continues their development with knight to f6, knight to e5, there's a double attack on the pawn, and it just falls. One sample line, let's say, goes g6, knight captures c4, bishop to g7, knight b6, queen b6, bishop to b5 check, the knight can block on d7, and now bishop to g5, preventing castling as the e-pawn falls. You can see white's pieces are all very nicely placed, they're all coordinating super well, while black basically only has one good piece in this bishop and not really much else to write about. In some higher strategic sense, they're probably just completely lost here. So Mieses gives up on any hope of saving the pawn, and he plays bishop to g4, allowing a5, and after the knight jumps back to d7, bishop captures on c4. So Lasker's regained his pawn with the same sort of beautiful-looking Queen's Gambit accepted positions that have been played many times over. Mieses starts his kingside development by playing the move g6, and now Lasker thrusts forward with a6. Not a strictly necessary move, but it does more or less force black to harm their pawn structure further. If you try to avoid any exchanges here with, say, b6, Then bishop to b5 is just a permanently cramping move. This piece is pinned for the foreseeable future. These pawns are doing absolutely nothing, and black is just getting squeezed here. So b captures on a6 is more or less forced, and Lasker is in no rush to take the pawn back. He can of course take it whenever, so he continues his own development with bishop to f4. Mieses is able to eliminate this bishop by playing bishop to h6. We have bishop captures h6, knight captures h6, and now the tactics start to come into the air with queen to d2, trying to go after this knight. First, Mieses ruins the pawn structure by exchanging on f3, and now in this position I found actually two different move orders that were played. One with queen to b6 being played here, the other where black first threw in knight to e5, and only after bishop to e2 did he play queen to b6. The larger publication that I found in the larger German chess newspaper had queen to b6, so that's what I'm going to go with here. Now the point behind queen to b6 makes a lot of sense. If queen captures on h6, then queen captures on b2, wins material for black. The white king is in a very bad spot, so this would be absolutely terrible for white. The other point is that on rook captures a6, if knight to e5 here, this particular move order allows white to play the move queen to c3, guarding the f3 pawn, getting out of any knight forks that the king and queen could fall under. But in the position where bishop to e2 is played, here black would actually have access to queen captures on a6, because if bishop captures on a6, then of course knight captures on f3, forks the king and the queen, and again wins material for black. Lasker of course sees this, and so he simply develops his knight to c3. Now in this move order is where knight to e5 and bishop to e2 were played, and because the knight is now properly hanging, Mieses decides to try to protect it by thrusting forward with g5. Now the question is, can white take this pawn? Well, on queen captures on g5, queen captures on b2 is still a reasonable response from black. It doesn't win anything because white is able to respond with rook to c1, everything is nicely protected for now, and black is forced to play knight back to g8. Now, there are a handful of good moves here for white, and you could argue for quite a few of them. Obviously, the most interesting comes after queen captures on e5. We do give up the exchange, as queen captures on c1 even comes with check, but after knight to d1 there are no more checks, and black is forced to deal with the threat on the h8 rook. After f6, white gets to play queen to c7, now threatening queen to c6, and on rook to d8, white has exactly one move here that keeps the advantage, and that's f4. Probably not the hardest move to find. You're threatening now bishop to h5 with check. This rook is going to infiltrate on the g-file, and I can't imagine that with this kind of development, black is going to survive the upcoming attack unscathed. Lasker decided against that, and he instead played the move king to f1. And I can certainly understand this. Even with the queen on g5, you always have to be worrying about at some point knight captures on f3 tactics becoming available, and this simply removes that option entirely. This does allow Mieses to play the move c4, and again here queen captures on g5 is certainly a move, but if it wasn't on Lasker's agenda last move, it probably won't be on this one either, and indeed he instead plays the move h4. This more or less forces Mieses to respond with g4, which he does. Now there's a whole bunch of nice pressure on the f3 pawn. After knight to a4, kicking the queen over to f6, Lasker deals with this pressure by playing f4 himself. The f3 square is still open, and so the black knight lands on f3, and the queen under attack slides to e3, ensuring that the f4 pawn is always taken care of. Rook to c8 for Mieses, rook to c1, and now he plays the move queen to d6. The justification for this is that in the event of b3, he's able to play the move queen to b4, and the commentators of the day believed that this would allow black to save the game. Now this definitely does allow him a very good position, with the one exception that if white were to play the very specific move king to g2, he would maintain the advantage. Who knows if Lasker would find this? Lasker instead decides to start by exchanging off this very powerful knight here on f3. Bishop captures f3, g captures f3. And now the commentators were discussing that if queen captures on f3, black gets a lot of good attacking chances with rook to g8, and these are the kinds of positions that Mieses enjoys, so it's debatable if you want to allow this. So with that in mind, I'm somewhat confused why Lasker would instead decide to play the move queen to d4, because this still allows the same attacking chances. Rook to g8 is played here, but now there's this pawn on f3 taking away these squares from the king and making life even more difficult for Lasker. The reason he played queen to d4 was that he instead wanted to take this pawn on c4, but from the perspective of wanting your king to be safe, I'm not sure I can get behind this. Now the attack can't go through right away because of course this rook on c8 needs to be dealt with. Trading is certainly one option. The commentators thought that rook to d8 was best, and now you return to the fact that this f4 pawn is still under attack, they give two different ways to defend it. If f5, then this opens up the e5 square, and black is going to take it over through knight to g4, and after the move they give is knight to c5. Knight to e5, and black's position is actually quite manageable here. While if the queen returns back to e3, once again defending it, then now the rook is able to slide down to g4 and attack it. And it's noted that there's a very important tactic that doesn't work for white here, rook to c6. You would think this is a very nice skewer that simply wins a piece, but black is able to simply take on c6. dc6, rook d1 forces queen to e1, rook e1, king e1, rook f4. Black maintains the extra pawn into the endgame and has very reasonable chances of converting it. Mieses did not play rook to d8. Rather, he defended his rook through queen to d7. It was believed that this move completely loses for black, and while it's not quite that bad, it does allow Lasker a very strong initiative, starting with rook captures on c8 with check. Queen captures on c8, of course, and after knight to c5, Mieses played the move king to f8, dodging any queen to a4 check business. However, Lasker is still able to continue the attack by thrusting forward with d6, e captures d6, queen captures d6 with check, king to e8, and now f5. Lasker's threat is very transparent. He wants to play f6, queen to e7, checkmate, game over. Now, you don't have to allow the checkmate as black, of course it's nowhere near forced, but the positions where if the pawn gets to f6 are very unpleasant. For example, knight to g4. On f6 here, queen to d8 creates a double attack here on the f6 pawn, and this is something that white has to be very careful in dealing with. The only sequence that works for white here is queen to c6 check, king to f8, knight to d7 check, king back to e8, knight to b6 with the discover check, and after king to f8, this knight is able to relocate to d5. The pawn on f6 is sufficiently protected, black's king is completely stuck, and I have to believe that as we get closer to the time control, as this is white's 34th move, there's going to be some tactic that black is going to fall into that'll lose something. I just cannot see them surviving this position without giving away something. So if Mieses' calculation got him to that point, I can understand why he wouldn't like that position, and I can further understand why he decided to go for a very desperate move, knight captures on f5, giving up the knight for the two pawns and creating a surprisingly well defensible position. E captures f5, queen captures f5 comes with the immediate threat of queen to b1, leading to checkmate. So this is something that Lasker has to deal with. He starts in a rather sensible way, queen to b8 with check, and after king to e7, excuse me, Lasker played queen to a7. And believe it or not, this is perhaps the only bad checking square. Now to understand why, we have to compare this with, for example, queen to c7 with check. Let's play the same moves that Mieses goes on to play in the game. King to f8, queen to d8 check, king to g7, rook to g1 with check, and now king to h6. Very, very important here is that white has access to the move queen to d2 with check, which allows white to win the tempo needed to pick up this rook here, but also continues to defend against the checkmating threat starting with queen to b1, as now queen to e1 is a move. Here, white would be completely winning. With queen on a7, things are completely different. King to f8, queen to b8 with check, king to g7, and now if Lasker were to play rook to g1 check, king to h6, what is going to be the follow-up here? Queen to d6 with check? The king simply slides over to h5, and again, you don't have time to take this because queen to b1 leads to checkmate. So white has to play some move to stop this, and in the upcoming future, black is going to play queen to h3, pick up this rook here on g1, and suddenly it's black who will be winning. So seeing this, Lasker decided not to play rook to g1. He instead decided to play the move queen to b4. Very efficient, guarding his knight and keeping an eye on the e1 square so that he can still prevent checkmate. However, despite all this, the position is still winning for Mieses. He has exactly one move that allows him to have, for the first time in this match, a one game. So what I want you to do, pause the video, see if you can find the move that Mieses has here that allows him to win the game. All right, 3, 2, 1. The only move that not only wins for Mieses, but doesn't lose for Mieses is rook to d8. And this is a move that the commentators didn't even see how strong it was. Rook to d8 just comes with the twin threats of rook to d1 and queen to b1, and you can't deal with both of them. If both of the pieces hit the back rank, then the poor queen sitting alone on e1 can't do anything. And if you go back to e1 prematurely to stop any of the checkmating threats, then the queen simply takes on c5, and white's pieces are just incredibly awful. Black is going to come up with some sort of way to take advantage of this back rank, and they're just completely winning. Mieses, however, did not find rook to d8, which is very surprising to me because this is the type of aggressive position that I thought he would thrive in. He instead tried to tuck his king into safety by playing king to h8, but unfortunately for him, after queen to d4 with check, f6 is forced, and now Lasker stops every threat with knight to d3. The diagonal is cut off, and now Mieses is more or less just down a knight for absolutely nothing and has to find compensation somewhere in this chaotic mess. So this time Mieses plays a reasonable move. He starts with the move rook to c8. Now, the point behind this is that if white plays any sort of slow move, queen captures on d3 becomes an option. This comes with check and forks the queen. If you play queen captures d3 check, then rook to c1 comes with a mate. Very straightforward. So Lasker very smartly avoids this by playing king to e1. After queen to a5 with check, Lasker blocks with b4. And on rook to e8 check, he actually goes back to f1. Mieses returns to f5, but now we can see that having the rook slid from the c8 to the e8 square is very good for white, as now the checkmating threats aren't on the table. And with his 40th move, this is Lasker's 40th move, he makes the time control by playing the absolute best move, h5. Now the rook is able to enter the game at long last, as it has access to the h4 square. As for Mieses' 40th move, it's hard to find one that is too satisfactory, but he ultimately decides on queen to e6, which does more or less force a queen trade, which one would assume is better for white, and on paper it is, but we'll see the upcoming endgame is actually a lot harder to win than you would think. The only two options that white has here are queen to e3 or queen to f4. In the case of queen to f4, the problem is that white has to deal with a long string of checks: queen to e2, king to g1, rook to g8, king to h2, rook to g2, king to h3, queen to e6, and king to h4. And in this particular position, black is out of checks, and technically the king is safe, but I can't imagine that Lasker would feel too comfortable going into this type of position against Mieses. So Lasker instead agreed to the queen trade by playing queen to e3, and he says, "I'm up a piece, and I'm probably the better endgame player. Let's go for it." So Mieses has basically no choice but to accept here. Queen captures e3, f captures e3, rook captures e3, and now we get to play this endgame. So the knight is under attack, of course. How do you defend it as white? Lasker decided to play the move knight to f4, and unfortunately for him, this brings the endgame from winning to drawn in one move. Now the commentators thought that this endgame was a draw all along. They mentioned the move knight to c5, which is the best move for white. However, they throw it away by saying that black can respond with a5, and on b captures a5, rook to a3 comes. This pawn is going to get picked up, and white just doesn't have enough pawns to win the endgame. And this is correct. They are correct that if b captures a5, then black draws very easily. What they miss, however, is that white has access to the move king to f2. Now, there are a handful of variations that we could analyze here. I think that the most critical comes in the line after rook to e5, and it's that white should recognize that the rook endgame is winning. B captures a5, rook captures c5, and rook to a1. Now white will equalize the material very surely. They are down a pawn, but of course this f3 pawn is going to fall whenever white wants to. And the endgame is actually completely winning. Now let's go over it real quickly. For example, black can try rook to c7, a6, and rook to a7, getting in the way of this pawn. Fairly straightforward start. King captures f3. Let's play king to g7 as black, king to g4, and now let's suppose that black tries to go after the h-pawn. On king to h6, king to f5 is a very clever reply. King captures h5 is not possible because of rook to h1 with checkmate, so the king is forced back to g7. Now here, white has access to the move rook to a5, so that on king to h6, the king can capture on f5, and the rook defends the h-pawn. So here, black again has very little to do other than simply wait. If they play king to f7, then white is able to play h6, taking away the g7 square. And now we've put black in a position where all they can really do is shuffle the king back and forth, and white is able to slowly make progress. King to e7, let's put the rook back somewhere. It's important that the rook isn't on the 5th rank so that we can put the rook on the e-file without it being taken. So king to f7, let's shuffle one more time. And then once the king returns to the e-file, we can play rook to the e-file with check. And after king back to f7, rook to e6. White is going to win the e-pawn. and the rook and king should do a good job of bullying this king into submission, picking up something, and eventually white is going to win this game. It's going to take a little bit, as rook endgames tend to do, but this is completely winning for white. After knight to f4, Mieses is forced to be a little bit precise here, but this is ultimately drawn. He starts in what makes the most sense, rook to e4, coming with a nice little fork on the knight and the pawn. Lasker plays the trickiest move, rook to h4. Now, of course, there are knight to f6 checks ideas in the air, but Mieses blocks all of these by playing f5. Very, very important. Not only does this defend the rook, but it also takes the g4 square away from Lasker's rook, keeping this piece very passive and helping the drawing odds significantly. After king to f2, Mieses is now allowed to bring his king onto the g file with impunity. So he does with king to g8. King captures f3, and now rook captures on b4. Now, the problem that Lasker faces is, of course, rook and knight versus rook is a theoretically drawn endgame. So if Lasker wants to win this game, he needs to keep his pawn alive while dealing with the huge massive pawns that Mieses has. If this pawn comes off the board, the game is drawn and there's nothing Lasker can do about it. So we're going to be seeing him try to hold on to this pawn for as long as possible. He starts by playing rook to h1. Of course, you have to get this rook into the game somehow. Rook to b3 check forces the king backwards, so Lasker puts it on f2, and now king to g7. Knight to e6 check, and after king to f6, the knight goes down to d4, hitting the rook. The rook escapes this check by going to b2, and after king to e3, a5. Frustratingly for Lasker, I put this position into the engine just to confirm, and this position is drawn even without this a-pawn, which really shows you just how futile his position is, but he has to try. He's been winning for this whole game, and he's going to keep going for as long as he can. After rook to f1, Mieses plays a move that I can only describe as cold-blooded, king to g5. He gives up this pawn with check, but it's of course completely irrelevant. The pawns for Mieses don't matter. He's not trying to win this game. His sole goal is taking this pawn, and he can do so. Because after king to g4, if the rook were to take on a5, then rook to h2, picks up the pawn, and it's a draw. And if you play the move that Lasker did, h6, then rook to b6, and there is no way to defend this. You would like the knight to be able to go to f5 to defend it, but of course that is not possible. So Lasker throws in one last try. He plays rook to f1. After rook captures on h6, he plays rook to g1 with check. King to h5 is forced, and now king to f4. Now, if the white rook is able to get to g5, then the black king will actually just get checkmated. So Mieses has to deal with this threat, and he does so through rook to f6 with check, and after knight to f5, h6. The g5 square is guarded, and with that, Lasker is out of tricks. Now, he doesn't throw the game right away. They play for a little bit longer, but there's no more drama, really. Rook to g2, a4, rook to g1, a3, rook to g2, a2, and now as the pawn is about to queen, Lasker plays rook, captures on a2, and Mieses is able to escape to g6. The rook goes back to g2 with check, but king to f7, king to e5, and now rook to e6 with check, king to d5, and Mieses plays a very nice move, rook to e1. He recognizes that he's about to have to play the rook and knight versus rook endgame, with knight captures on h6 check, and the way you survive this game as the losing side, or the worst side, I suppose, is to keep your rook and king as far away as possible so that there are no chances for knight forks. So Mieses is in check, so he plays the move king to f6, rook to f2 check, king to g5, knight to f7 check, king to g4, knight to e5 check, king to g3, and after Lasker threw his rook up to f7, Mieses again moved his rook as far away as possible with rook to a1. And at long last, it was here on move 70 that the players agreed to the draw. So as this has been a very long game, both in terms of the number of moves and the length of time that I've spent talking into this microphone, I'm going to keep the postmortem very short. This game is very frustrating. I think more so for Lasker than for Mieses, but also kind of for me. As someone who could not figure out precisely why Mieses got the master title, seeing him play these kinds of openings where he's just completely losing within the first 10 moves has not really helped my confidence in him. This time he was able to survive, and there was a chance that he could have won in this particular position. Had he found rook to d8, then we would actually be looking at a completely drawn match right now, but he wasn't able to. I suppose he was not really thinking about going on the attack after being attacked for so long, but, you know, he did have a chance. He wasn't able to make the most of it, but neither was Lasker. So after 3 games, the score is the exact same. Lasker has 1 win, Mieses has 0. And once again, we're going into game number 4 in the exact same position that we were in at game number 2. So there's still much more chess to look forward to, and I look forward to seeing you there. So until then.